Hello everyone, this is Video Game Growing Pains, and this time I have a brand new mic. Hopefully this will make the sound quality just a tiny bit better. Anyway, before we move on to what I would like to call the era of change in Final Fantasy, I want to talk a little bit about what led up to the era of change. You see, Final Fantasy had always been a game series, and all the way up through 12, that's what it was well known for. However, it began to have a bit of a media expansion at that point. Squaresoft thought that it would be able to expand to other medias, most notably film. You see, Final Fantasy's director, Hironobu Sakaguchi, had wanted to create a feature-length film, and he did so. This was known as Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. Unfortunately, it was Final Fantasy in name only. Everything else was very sci-fi, much different from the typical Final Fantasy formula, and more so, it bore nothing, no kind of resemblance to the adventures or the grandiose storytelling or the in-depth character development that we had come to know. There was an interesting story, certainly, and something that it wanted to tell, but Final Fantasy fans felt betrayed at the box office when they went to see it, myself included. I was incredibly angry at the movie. I was so livid that it had dared itself to call Final Fantasy. And this movie was a colossal failure. It was such a failure that there are rumors that the movie is what caused Squaresoft to merge with Enix to become Square Enix, the failure of it. And Sakaguchi never quite lived that down, and would eventually leave Squaresoft to found his own company. The problems, however, were not just with the movie. The medium of video games itself was changing, and Squaresoft, and then Square Enix wanted to move with the times to improve their medium, to gain a larger audience, and to gain more, I guess, finger quotes, widespread market appeal. And how did this happen? Well, with the dawn of the PlayStation 2, not only could we get much prettier graphics, but voice acting became the hot new thing. Voice acting was possible on the PS1, but the PS2 made it almost a necessity. If your game was not made by Nintendo, then not having voice acting was a serious mark against you. So, Final Fantasy X was the first game to include voice acting, and it was a mixed bag at best. From 10 onward, changes and clumsy missteps followed the Final Fantasy series. The Final Fantasy series had always gone through minor changes throughout its incarnations. However, nothing quite as drastic as what we would come to see in the PlayStation 2 and 3 era. And this sets the groundwork for the eventual fall of the series and what would come to be known as the retro revival, where old school games that very seemed like the original Final Fantasies, 1 through about 6 or 7, would become incredibly popular because Square wasn't making Final Fantasy anymore. Anyway, we'll get there. Right now, I just want to make sure that everyone understands the era we're going into. Squaresoft has just released Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, and it has been a colossal failure. Final Fantasy IX was released to widespread love by the fans, but perhaps not quite as commercial success as they would have liked. Final Fantasy X is their chance to wow a new audience and to step into the new high-powered medium of DVD, where CD-ROMs were the driving force behind the PlayStation 1 era. DVDs would be the driving force behind the PlayStation 2. So they tried to expand outward to make everything bigger, badder, better, and in the coming days to try and expand the Final Fantasy brand. I talked about how they tried movies, but Square would later try merchandise, tie-in deals. Final Fantasy Advent Children is well known for having a phone tie-in deal where all of the characters used phones from a specific company. You could own the phone. They tried selling energy drinks, but there is no quite example of expanding market appeal quite as much as Final Fantasy XI, which turned the series into an MMO. Square wanted to try and keep getting returns on their games, to try and continue to make money with less and less effort. And while the Final Fantasy games would still receive a high level of polish, we would start receiving a lot of sequels, a lot of spin offs, a lot more than we had gotten previously. The area of change saw Final Fantasy not just branching out from video games, but branching out from genres, trying to do new or expand into sub-series. This was clear with Final Fantasies 10, 11, and 12, with 10 being a standard RPG, 11 being an MMO, and 12 being an offline MMO. We'll get to that, trust me. But they also released games for the GameCube, creating an entirely new spin-off series called Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, which was closer to Final Fantasy than Spirits Within, but still far away from what we had come to expect. And they tried to expand to handhelds as well, having a few titles already on handhelds, like Final Fantasy Legend or the Final Fantasy games that would come later. And they started making sequels. The PlayStation 2 era was where a lot of the sequels I talked about for Final Fantasy VII emerged. So it's not just an age of change, but an age of expansion. That's the thing that you need to think about when we go into this era. So, well, we may as well dive head first. Coming up next time is Final Fantasy X. See you next time.